Welcome to this episode of Crime Inc. Every episode we'll take a look at an aspect of the criminal justice system through the eyes of our guests. My name is Alexander Benikov and I'll be your host. I'm a defense lawyer, author, adjunct law professor, and I've always been interested in the world of crime and punishment. Really excited about our guest this week. She has a great deal of knowledge in this area. Professor Reeder. Am I saying that right?
Writer, but
Writer, I'm sorry. I even asked beforehand and I still screwed it up. She's done a lot of really interesting work and research in the areas of prisons and Supermax, max prisons, and I wanted to have her on. Professor, can you just give a little bit of your background?
Sure. So I'm a professor of criminology, law and society, and also work with the School of Law at the University of California, Irvine. And my work is mainly focused on kind of the most extreme ends of mass incarceration and prisons. So I published a book last year called 23/7 about the rise of long-term solitary confinement across the United States. So that's sort of touching on some of it.
Yeah. So what got you interested in criminal defense and prisons specifically?
Well, I actually started teaching in prison when I was in college, just as a volunteer instructor, because I was interested in teaching and curious about what the institutions would be like. And I got through that work, got very interested in prison policy. I met a lot of people who, had a lot of horrific experiences or experienced abuses in the system. And I got more and more interested in how we got the system we had. So I've done advocacy work around prisons and prisoners' rights issues. But as I did more advocacy work, I came to see how little we knew about kind of the basics of the history of how we got the prisons we have, and oftentimes about the basics of who's inside prisons and why. And so I got more and more interested in doing research, kind of gathering the basic data we needed to even think about the questions we needed to ask or the right policies to think about in terms of reform.
Very cool. And I'm guessing you were pretty young at the time?
Yeah, I started teaching in prison as a freshman in college,
wow.
But then I did advocacy work for a few years after college before really turning back to graduate school and focusing more on research.
How were you received? Did it vary, or what do you remember about that? I'm curious.
Sorry, how was I received? What?
By the inmates being such a young instructor and just being, from the outside, teaching on the inside.
I first, the first facility I taught in was a juvenile detention facility in Boston. And I think there I was kind of surprised, and I imagine the prisoners were surprised too at kind of, how much we had in common. Like at the time they were my age, right? They were 16, 17, 18, trying to figure out what they were going to do with their lives and where they might be able to go to college. And that was surprising to me. I think I expected something else. And then learning with them about the kinds of barriers they face to achieving any of the things they hope to face was surprising again. So
interesting. So let's get into Supermax prison. So first, what is a Supermax prison?
There's a lot of debate over that. But I generally think of a Supermax and I think there's some consensus about the definition as a facility designed, kind of a single-purpose facility designed for long-term solitary confinement. So a place where people are sent when they either break in-prison rules or are labeled dangerous within a prison system, and they're usually sent there for more than a few months. So when I say long-term solitary confinement, I'm talking about anywhere from 6 months to 5 or 10 or more years. And when we say a Supermax, we often mean, while lots of prisons have, a few cells designed for isolation or segregation for the shorter term, a Supermax is generally a facility where, the entire facility or a huge portion of the facility is designed for this kind of confinement. So a lot of my work has focused on Pelican Bay prison in Northern California, which was one of the early Supermaxes built in the 1980s, and it's often considered kind of an archetype of this model. It has 1,056 beds designed for long-term isolation. So we're talking, not a few dozen, but 1,000.
So what was, as far as like the public policy or the politics behind building these prisons, was it that, we're going to put all the supposed worst of the worst and have them in one place, or what was the thinking?
Well, it's interesting interesting is the first Supermax opened in Arizona in 1986, and then California quickly made a bigger and better one basically in 1989. And then over the course of the early 90s, almost every state built a Supermax. So the conversation, one of the things I often talk about in criminal justice is how many decisions are made at a local level and how much kind of understanding local politics is important to that. So, the conversation differed as different states built it, but the early Supermaxes in places like Arizona and California were really built and designed by prison officials. And the sort of first layer part of the story is that they were built during the period of the rise of mass incarceration. So prison populations were rising, especially in Arizona and California, and states were engaged in big prison building projects in order to house that growing population. So over the course of the 1980s and 1990s, California built 23 new prison facilities, and Pelican Bay was just one. So one piece of the story is just states were building new prisons, and they were looking around for modern, technologically advanced models, and Arizona had prison officials had designed one in collaboration with architects. Other states saw that and copied it. But there's a deeper backstory, I argue, in my work on the history of places like Pelican Bay, which is that prison officials thought they needed a facility like Pelican Bay because of things that had happened in the prisons in the 1970s, actually. Across the U.S., there was a lot of organized resistance in prisons, and there were moments in specific state prisons where this resistance turned violent. So in California in 1971, that was George Jackson, a well-known writer. He published a best-selling book of letters. He allegedly tried to escape from San Quentin. He was shot when he ran out of the isolation unit where he was being housed. And when the guards ran back into his cell, they found 3 other guards and 2 prisoners who had been killed. They'd been stabbed. So that was an incredibly violent moment in California. 2 weeks later, the revolt at Attica happened in New York, where an entire prison group of prisoners organized and took over the prison. When state police re-entered that prison, more than 30 people were killed, prisoners and staff at the institution, in the process of the retaking, most killed by the state police. But those 2 moments are representative. There were moments like that throughout state prisons across the U.S. over the 70s. Those 2 moments are kind of 2 of the more famous, and they are moments that prison officials point to in explaining the need for a place like a Supermax. So in California, prison officials talk about how the Supermax was a place where they could put the people who worked with George Jackson, who were his collaborators in his alleged escape attempt. And indeed, when the Supermax opened, even though it was 18 years after George Jackson's alleged escape attempt, one of his co-conspirators who'd been in isolation since 1971 was transferred up to Pelican Bay when it opened. So there's this interesting longer arc of history to understanding these institutions, in part as a response to organizing happening in the prisons in the 70s. And today people talk about them as places that are designed for safety and security. So they're not talked about as punitive places, even though the conditions are incredibly restrictive. But they're talked about places that are necessary to maintain institutional safety and security because the people there are dangerous. Although recent research has really called into question the basis of those assessments.
And Attica was a big national story, right?
Absolutely. And so, George Jackson's death is less remembered, but it was really a big national story at the time also.
And from my understanding with Attica now, we know that, a lot of the injuries were caused by the guards going in or the troops or the police. But at the time, the understanding was more that it was the inmates that caused everything, right?
Exactly. Part of what's complicated about these stories is that there was so little transparency in these institutions in the 70s and continues to be so little transparency most of the time today that it took a long time to unravel exactly what happened. And in fact, no one ever really explained what happened with George Jackson. The story prison officials told was that his lawyer smuggled a gun and a wig into him inside a tape recorder. But none of those things were ever found. The gun wasn't found, and it was never explained exactly what happened. And all the people accused of trying to assist Jackson in his escape, their convictions were ultimately overturned, except one, the guy who was sent to Pelican Bay when it opened. So same with Attica, right? It's taken decades to kind of unravel what actually happened and to understand that it wasn't the prisoners who caused the vast majority of the violence in the end.
Yeah, it's funny how we tend not to like complicated stories, right?
Yes, exactly.
Or we could do a different episode about how our country doesn't love learning as much as some other places, but that's a different issue.
Right. I know when people ask me about the cause of the Supermax, I'm like, well, there's all these different reasons, but
like no, yeah,
really, there is.
I want the simple one. They're for the bad people. Okay.
Exactly.
Just for comparison, do other countries have anything like Supermax prisons that you know of?
They do, actually, and this is a real interest of mine. I think, one aspect of U.S. incarceration policies is that we have a bad tendency to export them around the world in various ways. One example of that is that Guantanamo is modeled on the highest security facilities at Guantanamo were modeled on U.S. Supermax facilities. But that happens in other places too. As criticisms of solitary confinement practices in the U.S. have grown, other states have started to look at this too. There's massive litigation in Canada right now because they have some similar policies. I've actually spent the last few summers in Denmark studying their prisons, and while their prisons are, for the most part, much more humane than ours, most of them tend to look more like college campuses than the kinds of prisons we think of. They tend not to have walls. And prisoners can come and go. Even so, Denmark uses a fair amount of solitary confinement, both, within smaller facilities within those so-called open prisons, but they also have one closed prison they opened about 10 years ago that has a few dozen cells for long-term solitary confinement, and they're about to open a new high-security facility that'll have a few dozen more cells for long-term solitary confinement. So people are often surprised to hear that even in a Scandinavian country that's known for exceptionally humane punishment, solitary confinement is being used, and in contexts not completely dissimilar to the United States.
Interesting. Yeah, because, the kind of narrative is that, their prisons are great and perfect and, ours are bad. And again, the oversimplification.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there are definitely things that they do better, but they also still, have similar challenges in terms of dealing with gang violence in the prison and serious mental health issues among the prisoners and overuse of isolation.
Yeah. And we'll get a little bit more into that. What kind of, you touch on this, but what kind of inmate ends up in a Supermax facility, or what are some of the types?
So in general, there's two ways prisoners get sent to isolation or solitary confinement. Usually they break an in-prison rule. So, the more severe end of that would be participating in a riot or attempting to murder a staff member or fellow prisoner. And in most prison systems, that might land you in isolation for a year or two, or even a few years, more than that, for a disciplinary violation. But there are estimates today that, as many as 80,000 people are in these conditions of long-term solitary confinement across the U.S., and many for years at a time. And the underlying justifications for those are that prisoners get labeled as dangerous by the prison system. And this varies a lot by the prison system, but California's policies up until they were reformed under litigation pressure 2 years ago were that a prisoner could be labeled a gang member based on any three pieces of evidence in their prison file. And the pieces of evidence were things we might traditionally think of as basic First Amendment rights. The kinds of tattoos you had, the kind of people you were socializing with on the prison yard, the kinds of drawings you had, people you were writing letters to, any three things like that. Books you were reading, so George Jackson's letters, for instance, could be one piece of evidence that would get you validated as a Black guerrilla family member. So those three pieces of evidence like that would get you labeled a gang member in California. And once you were labeled a gang member, you could be sent to isolation at a Supermax like Pelican Bay indefinitely. So for the duration of your criminal sentence. And those kinds of status determinations of people as dangerous for some reason, I think, are driving a lot of the longer terms in long-term solitary confinement.
And I'm assuming there isn't much of a due process for getting labeled or classified.
Exactly. I mean, these are generally administrative hearings within the prison system run by staff. In the case of something like getting labeled a gang member, sometimes the information is actually classified and the prisoner isn't even allowed to see it. The Supreme Court, in the one case where they have looked at conditions in long-term solitary confinement, a case called Austin v. Wilkinson, they found that the prisoners did have a liberty, some small liberty interest in not being placed in these conditions, and so they had to have minimal due process, and that meant they had to have some notice of why they were being sent there, some opportunity to respond, and some kind of regular review. So in most prison systems, that's like at least annual. There has to be some kind of review of the status. But that's, there's no right to a lawyer, no right to an appeal through any kind of, level system, no right necessarily to a hearing where you can call witnesses.
And you probably get a lot of the same issues that I get with my clients, right, where they don't have an attorney. A lot of them aren't very educated.
Right. I mean, it's a huge problem when you look at just the basic demographics of who's in our prisons. Illiteracy rates are incredibly high. Average reading ability rates tend to be around the elementary school level. And so to expect someone in that kind of context to be able to mount a defense by themselves, especially if they're not even able to see all the evidence against them, it's pretty tough. People can really feel like they get caught up in the system and they have no recourse.
I'm curious now, do you know what the illiteracy rates are?
Wow, they vary by state, but I think I've seen numbers as high as, a quarter to more.
Wow.
And it also depends on how you rate literacy.
Right.
Functional literacy can be incredibly low too, as opposed to sort of what grade level are you scoring at?
Right, makes sense. So, describe for us when somebody gets shipped or transferred to one of these facilities. What do they see? They walk into the facility or their cell.
One prisoner described driving up to Pelican Bay to me as feeling like he was pulling up to a Star Wars spaceship. These buildings tend to kind of be just these solid cement blocks. They often don't have any windows in them, and they might be just, covered in razor wire. So, people describe them as being very austere just when you drive up to them. And often prisoners know, if they're put on a bus, say they get labeled a gang member, they're put on a bus from a general population prison up to a facility like this, they know that it might be years before they get out or have human contact again. And so the descriptions of those kinds of drives are incredibly poignant, as you might imagine. But then the cells, when a prisoner actually goes into the cell, usually prisoners in these kinds of facilities are stripped before they go on into the cell, and stripped if they come out for any reason at all, to go to yard or to have a visit should they have one. These places tend to be in pretty rural places. Visits usually only happen behind bulletproof glass, so often prisoners don't even want to see their families in that context, even if their families are able to come visit. So a prisoner, would enter a cell. The cells are usually about 8 by 10 feet. So imagine a wheelchair accessible bathroom stall or a generous parking space. Pretty small. In Pelican Bay, there are no windows. In some of the more modern facilities, windows have been a point of litigation. Some of them have really small slit windows. There are fluorescent lights in the cells that are usually on 24 hours a day for, prison staff, say, for monitoring or surveillance purposes. The cells usually have just a poured concrete ledge that serves as a bunk, usually with a really thin foam mattress over it. And then usually there's a steel toilet sink combination in one corner. Some cells have showers, but it's more common that the cells are grouped together on pods, often of 8 to 10 cells with one shower at the end. And an officer in a central control booth looks out over multiple pods. He just has a computer-controlled door system. He'll open one door at a time, and maybe 3 times a week, a prisoner is allowed out to go shower or to go out into an outdoor exercise yard, which is often just a little bigger than the size of the cell. In California, they're about twice the size. Prisoners often describe them as dog runs. Sometimes they're just cages. People in these conditions talk about going years at a time without shaking someone's hand, without seeing another living thing. So if a bird flies outside over those cages or dog runs, that's a memorable experience. People talk about not seeing the moon for years at a time. So that just kind of gives you a sense of the harshness. Mm. Usually, if prisoners behave over a certain period of time, they can earn a TV or a radio, but they have very limited access to writing materials or any kind of stimulation.
Preparing for this, I read an article, I don't remember which one it was, but it was saying they finally got a TV, but they were only allowed to watch, I think it was like religious program, like local religious programming. And they were saying, hey, it was almost worse than not having a TV.
sometimes the programming is incredibly limited. So it's an incredibly restrictive and harsh environment.
Are the doors usually like the old-fashioned bars or like the more modern, like sliding plexiglass or steel?
They're usually pretty solid. So they're often, really solid sliding steel, often completely sealed off. It's surprisingly common for prisoners in isolation to throw their own excrement out. And so a lot of times the doors are sealed, sometimes even with plexiglass or special kind of shields. Mm-hmm. In Pelican Bay, the doors, interestingly, are made of perforated steel, so they have these little tiny holes in them. So officers in the control booths can see in pretty well. The holes kind of blur together into this. You can kind of see through, but prisoners can't really see out at all up close. So that's another model that some facilities use. But part of Supermaxes is that they're these kind of modern iteration of isolation, hyper technologically advanced, and so the doors tend to be kind of a modern innovation in themselves. They usually have a little slot in them where a food tray can be slid in, and where prisoners can stick their hands out to be handcuffed, because when they leave the cell in this facility, say if they need to be escorted to a legal visit or to a doctor, usually they'd be escorted by at least 2 staff with their hands cuffed, and cuffed to their waist and their legs cuffed. So there's a little slot in the door to assist that, happening while the prisoner is in the cell.
Yeah. The title of your book alludes to this, but can you explain as far as like the hours spent in the cell and free time, how that works?
Yeah, exactly. So the title of the book is 23/7, which refers to the fact that prisoners spend usually an average of 23 hours a day, 7 days a week in these conditions. So in most facilities, there's a schedule where the prisoners get out of their cell for an hour or 2 at a time, maybe 3, if they're lucky, 4 days a week. And during that hour or 2, they could go out to an exercise yard or a dog run, and they could shower. In some facilities, there are phones in those exercise yards, and so the prisoners can also make phone calls during that time. In many facilities like Pelican Bay, the prisoners have no access to phones at all unless there's a death in the family.
Wow. So I want to get into mental health. Is it one of the biggest issue or the biggest issue? Where would you put it on the issues list?
There are so many issues.
Yeah.
to rank them sometimes, but mental health is certainly a massive issue when you think about long-term solitary confinement. In U.S. prisons in general, the people with mental illness are overrepresented relative to their presence in the general population of U.S. citizens, and they are overrepresented again in solitary confinement. So estimates are that it varies each institution that has done data analysis on this, but often the estimates are that more than half of people in isolation have some kind of mental illness. Most states that have looked carefully at this have held that people with pre-existing serious mental illnesses should not be put into isolation. But states don't do a great job of identifying and treating that, and it's not clear what happens to someone if they develop something that looks like a serious mental illness while they're in isolation. Rates of suicide are much higher in solitary confinement also, and rates of self-harm than they are in the general prison population. So it has serious mental health consequences. A lot of the research has been done in the context of litigation. So, a class of prisoners has been systematically interviewed, and their psychologists and psychiatrists have documented something they call SHU syndrome, or security housing unit. That's often the corrections term for these supermaxes. So SHU syndrome is a constellation of symptoms people develop in sensory deprivation or long-term isolation from human contact. They include things that look a lot like post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety attacks, heart palpitations, trouble sleeping, hallucinations. The symptoms range from the mental to the physical, and they can last even after people are released.
So I'm sure if I was to talk to one of the employees or the representatives from one of these facilities, they would say that everybody gets the care that they need, right?
Complicated.
I would hope they would at least say it.
Says the academic.
Yeah.
I think in some of the more progressive facilities that are looking at solitary confinement reform, people would say we need more resources to give people the care they need. I think some systems are getting to the point where they acknowledge that they're not, they need more psychological mental health staff in order to provide people the services they need.
So is it getting better? Is it staying the same? And I know every facility in every state's kind of different, but as far as like a trend with mental health care, are you seeing a shift one way or another?
Well, in the bigger picture, I think there has been a national turn against the kinds of solitary confinement conditions I'm describing in places like Pelican Bay. Pelican Bay was one of the biggest, and in the course of litigation over the last 3 years, that facility has been emptied out, and huge portions of it are being unlocked and converted into minimum security prisons just in the last few months. So that, I think, is representative of a national movement to reconsider the reasons people are being placed in these conditions and the length of time they're spending there, thinking about how expensive it is, the social consequences, the mental health consequences, and trying to be much more judicious in the use of these kinds of conditions. Now, the question of whether the mentally ill are being treated better is a really tough one, because I think we have a system where there are way more beds in prisons for seriously mentally ill people in jails and prisons than there are in hospital facilities. And so they are ending up in our prisons, and our prisons are struggling with how to deal with them, from massive jail systems like LA County, which is debating whether to build a huge new jail that's focused entirely on mental health treatment, to Supermaxes, where people are trying to reform these facilities and get people out of these conditions of long-term isolation. And one of the big challenges is dealing with seriously mentally ill prisoners who've been in these conditions for years and who need really intensive treatment that systems often don't have the resources to provide.
Yeah, researching or getting ready for this interview, it seemed like one of the big issues was people not getting their medicine and then getting progressively worse and then being treated the worse that they got. It became this vicious cycle. Is that something that you've seen where, the worse someone's mental health get, the more in trouble they get, the worse they're treated, the worse off their mental health is, and it just kind of keeps going?
Yes, it really, a really good way to describe it is a vicious cycle. So someone might be, I think I told you about how people end up in isolation because they break a prison rule or because they're labeled a gang member. But a much more simple way to think about it is people end up in isolation because they don't fit in the prison system, right? So they just have trouble following the rules, or it's not clear where they go. So, there's been attention recently to the fact that pregnant women, transgender prisoners, juveniles end up in isolation, sometimes because there's just no other safe place to put them in the prison system, or that's what prison officials say. And I think the same is true of prisoners with mental illnesses. Even someone who has a mild mental illness might really have trouble following prison rules or getting along with people in a general population prison system. They end up in isolation. And of course, we know even perfectly sane, normal, in experiments that have been done around sensory deprivation, perfectly sane, normal, young, healthy people experience pretty severe symptoms in these kinds of conditions. And so people who are, have some kind of predisposition can have a really hard time. And a lot of times they're under a kind of hyper surveillance in these facilities. I mentioned those perforated steel doors. They're being watched constantly. And so it's actually incredibly easy to break prison rules once you get sent to isolation, right? The rules are really strict. You can't yell at officers. You can't, you're often not supposed to talk to other prisoners as you walk by their cells to go out to the yard. It's actually very easy to get in trouble, and prisoners with mental illness often end up getting in more trouble in these facilities. Also, in many places, an attempted suicide is considered a disciplinary violation and gets you more time in isolation. So people with mental illnesses in particular end up in this kind of trapped in isolation often, where they just rack up more and more disciplinary problems, and they stay for a longer and longer time, and they get, health-wise, they get worse and worse. So it really is. And I've written about how it's kind of a self-reinforcing cycle, that once you have mentally ill people in isolation, and they have so much trouble behaving, and they're so difficult to manage, isolation begins to look incredibly necessary. So it kind of reinforces the need in a disturbing way.
You're probably familiar with the case. It was at the Colorado Supermax facility. I can't remember the inmate's name, but he started out, he'd get in a little trouble, but he got so bad he ended up cutting his own Achilles tendons and tattooing his own face. It was pretty shocking how bad it got.
The self-harm people commit in isolation is really horrifying. I mean, in every facility I've looked at, you hear stories about people cutting off digits, all kinds of really gruesome ways to commit self-harm.
Yeah. As far as, and again, I'm sure your facility is different, but as far as number of psychologists or psychiatrists, or at least people with some mental health training or counseling skills, is that something that's usually lacking, or does it just vary from facility to facility?
It varies, although I would say much like our prisons often being overcrowded,
Right.
the caseloads of these people tend to be incredibly high. I mean, I think it would be unusual to have more than one psychiatrist on staff at a facility like this, and then maybe a few, nursing level mental health care providers. But often, people's caseloads might be 100 or more prisoners, often many of whom, have serious needs. It's standard that in these kinds of facilities, there'd be an expectation that someone with some kind of mental health training would do regular, what are called cell checks or tier checks to see how people are doing. So, maybe once a week, someone has to walk through and sort of look at each person and say, how are you doing? Of course, that can be fairly superficial. A lot of prisoners say, other prisoners on the unit can hear anything they say, and they don't want to seem weak. They don't want to have a private health conversation with someone in that kind of context. So that kind of gives you a sense of the level of care that's often available.
Yeah, and mental health is such a taboo and open society that I can't imagine, what it's like inside prison, for an inmate to say, I need help, that, I'm having a hard time with this mental health issue. It doesn't seem like something you'd hear a lot.
Exactly. It comes with an even more intense stigma and taboo, and also more fear about the kind of treatment that they'll receive. So, I've had prisoners tell me they see that when people do ask for mental health assistance, they often get medicated, often with much older school psychiatric drugs than would be used in general society. So Thorazine, which was used in the 70s and 80s in the U.S., is still incredibly common in prison, and the side effects are really severe. And so prisoners say, maybe I would get help, but I'm so afraid of being medicated to the point of being catatonic or numb to the world that I'm afraid of the care I would get, even if I were comfortable asking.
Yeah, that makes sense. Has there been research on what a 23-hour lockdown does to people?
Yeah, there has. It's a little bit controversial. One, because a lot of the research, because these places are so closed, a lot of the research has happened in the context of litigation.
Right.
So, psychological and psychiatric experts have gone in and systematically interviewed groups of prisoners, but often in the process of certifying them as a class or to collect information for litigation. And so a lot of prison officials say that's a particular kind of research, but it's not the same as independent research. There's actually been a push in the last few years to more systematically study many different aspects of Supermax confinement. The National Institute of Justice last year put out a big call for research on these issues and put a few $1 million of funding towards it. There was one study in Colorado funded by the National Institute of Justice a number of years ago where prisoners were matched, so they had similar disciplinary histories, and some were assigned to isolation and some weren't, and they were tracked over the course of a year. And that study very controversially found limited impacts of solitary confinement on people, but it's been criticized on a number of levels. One, that it was only a year. Two, kind of criticizing the research design. The assessment was self-report, so it was graduate students going in and just asking people to report how they were feeling on a survey, and so it wasn't as robust as, say, a systematic psychological or psychiatric interview. And actually, it turns out a prisoner in that study committed suicide and was dropped from the study because they couldn't get any more data on them. So there were all these controversies around that. But it's I think representative of the fact that we do need more information. And people often ask me about the long-term effects of these facilities, and I say, well, we've been engaged in a mass experiment since the 1980s when we built the first of these, and we're just now beginning to see the results where people are getting out in larger numbers directly from these kinds of facilities and rejoining society. And, we're just beginning to see how are they doing? What are the long-term consequences? You
mentioned some research as far as like people on like sensory deprivation. What kind of results relating to, being in a cell 23 hours a day was found there?
Yeah, so there has been some interesting research, mostly in the 60s and 70s, largely around kind of military training questions on sensory deprivation. So what happens if you, put gloves on someone and an eye mask on them and leave them alone, or those kinds of, right? So kind of experimenting with conditions not unlike what happens in prison. And there people have, they've documented similar symptoms to the shoe syndrome I was describing, where people have hallucinations, anxiety attacks. In a number of those studies, people after a few hours have begged to leave the study and quit. So there is this sense that even for people not in an incarcerated setting who are volunteering in experiments, the experience can be pretty intense.
Do most people that end up in a Supermax facility at one point or another get released to general housing, or you know what I mean?
Yeah. So, on the one hand, there's a colloquialism about Supermaxes in states like California. Prisoners say the only way to get out is to parole, to snitch, or to die. So what they mean is once you get sent there, you're kind of stuck there, and either your criminal sentence expires because the prison system, remember, made the determination to send you to isolation, but that doesn't affect the sentence the judge gave you. So when your judicial sentence expires, you're released directly from isolation, which it turns out hundreds of people a year are released directly from long-term isolation in the biggest state prison systems like California, Texas, and New York. Or prisoners say you snitch, so that means the formal politically correct term is to debrief. So they give information about their gang to prove they are no longer members. Of course, then they're at risk in the prison population, but that can be another way out, or they die. So there's this sense that it's very hard to get out of isolation, but in practice, people cycle through at huge numbers. So, as I suggested, hundreds of people a year get out because their criminal sentence expires in every state that has these practices. People tend to cycle through. So, they might spend a year or two there, go back to the general population, either have trouble adjusting or have the same problems they had initially, be sent back to isolation. So again, states haven't systematically studied this to the degree one would want, but in the states that, have looked at it and among anecdotal stories, it seems like, it turns out the vast majority of people, just like the vast majority of people ultimately get out of prison, the vast majority of people ultimately get out of isolation. And that creates a whole other set of problems that we're just beginning to think about in terms of how those people adjust to general prison life or to life in our communities.
Just a couple more questions. So how much of a focus is there on rehabilitation versus just we're housing these people and keeping them away from everyone else? Because it seems like that's more of the focus.
Yeah, I think until a year or two ago, there was no question of supermaxes and long-term solitary confinement doing anything but warehousing, right? I mean, the idea was, the stated kind of justification was, these are the worst of the worst, and we've given up on them, right? We're just trying to isolate them from the rest of the population so that maybe we have a hope of helping other people. But there was no, you sort of, based on the kind of bareness of the conditions I described, you sort of have a sense that there's no investment in even the most moderate kind of well-being or stimulation for these prisoners. Now, as states have started to look at and question whether these kinds of practices make sort of financial or social sense, a lot of the reforms have revolved around the question of, well, what can we do, even in isolation, to try to re-socialize people, basically? And so states are experimenting with things like classroom spaces where prisoners are handcuffed to their desks, but at least they're able to make eye contact with each other and have some kind of group activity over a few hours a day. There was just a story about Portland, Oregon, and also Washington State have experimented with these nature imagery rooms. So they project either on a wall or on a TV screen, a cage, they project images of nature, so that prisoners who've been, in these cement blocks, never seeing a moon or a bird for years at a time, have some kind of, can see running water or mountains or trees. And there was some, the preliminary research in Oregon around this suggested that it really helped calm people down. There's an interesting question about whether an image of nature is a superficial reform or not, but right. It is representative of the kinds of attempts that are being made to say, these conditions are so restrictive and people do need help adjusting, and that should be more of an institutional goal.
Yeah. Last question for you. So, prison issues and prison reform isn't an issue that, you average people seem to care a ton about, right? As far as like the issues that they care about in their everyday life, or they say that, these people committed crimes, they need to be punished. So what do you say to people that, to basically just say, why should I care about, prison issues or inmate rights? This doesn't affect me directly, because I'm assuming you run into this a lot.
Yeah. Well, I would say a few things. The first thing I often say, especially to my students when I teach about this, is that massive portions of our tax dollars in a state like California are going to fund these kinds of systems. Keeping someone at Pelican Bay costs $90,000 per person per year.
Wow.
That's about the cost of sending 4 people to a state university here for a year. So, I think that's one way to think about, to say to people within a state, certain financial choices are being made with tax dollars. Often, in a state like California, and you look at the budgeting decisions over the last 10, 15 years, you see a real shift from education directly into incarceration. And so, those decisions have real world impacts on our everyday lives. And moreover, there's often not much transparency or documentation of how effectively that money is being spent. And so, one thing I say is, this is something as citizens that directly affect our own finances and personal choices, and a place where you might want more information than we currently have about it. Another point I often make is that we think of these places as being incredibly far away and these prisoners being the worst of the worst who are never getting out. But as I said, hundreds of these prisoners a year get out and come back to our communities. And when you think about it, it's kind of remarkable that we don't hear about them more. So, they're managing somehow. There have only been 2 horror stories of people being released directly from isolation, one in Colorado, one in Nebraska, and committing pretty horrific crimes. But I think even there, people have seen that as a question of how were they treated in isolation, and how did this happen, and a kind of a moment to reconsider whether the prison system might treat people better and not set people up to commit those kinds of crimes when they get out. And so I think that's to really think about the ways in which these decisions we make in these faraway facilities actually affect people who are coming home to our communities, people who are, I think a lot of the advocacy work in California that's been the most powerful is the work by mothers and sisters and partners of people in isolation, again, showing, there are people in isolation who haven't held their kids in 10, 15 years. And I think whatever you think about what that person did, the impact on their communities is really tangible in a way that people are just beginning to understand. And the last thing I would say is more a global perspective on our prisons, which is that I think a lot of our biggest social problems are magnified in our prisons. When you think about, we talked about illiteracy and education failures, healthcare, infectious diseases, mental health problems, race issues we barely touched on, but prisons have a racially disproportionate impact, and solitary confinement has an even more racially disproportionate impact. And so I think prisons are important as a way to understand kind of where things go wrong with social policy, and looking at those places a little more closely maybe can help us think about alternatives.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Professor. I know you have to run. Really appreciate your time again. Is there a website, or are you on Twitter where people can find you if they'd like?
Absolutely. So my website is kerametwriter.com. So it's KERA, M as in Mary, ETREITER.com. And I'm at KerametR at Twitter, and love to engage about these issues in a public forum. So
definitely.
Please,
and give the title of your book one more time.
The title of the book is 23/7 Pelican Bay Prison and the Rise of Long-Term Solitary Confinement.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for having me and for the really thoughtful questions.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.